The deed was in her hand, and the bank was closed, and Alma Brooks had not slept in 3 days. And still, the snow kept falling, as if the sky itself had decided that this particular widow had not yet suffered enough. She stood on the frozen boardwalk outside the First Territorial Bank of Caldwell, Kansas, in January of 1878, with her fingers going white around a folded piece of paper that represented every acre her husband had broken his back to earn. The wooden sign above the door swayed in the wind. Closed. Just that one word, painted in black letters that seemed almost gleeful in their finality. She had ridden 14 miles through a snowstorm to get here, and the bank was closed, and she had nowhere left to turn. Alma was 32 years old, and had the kind of face that still turned heads in church, even though she had stopped caring about that entirely in the 8 months since Thomas Brooks had dropped dead of a heart seizure in the south field while the corn was only knee-high. She had dark auburn hair that the cold had tangled, and green eyes that had once been quick to laugh, and were now mostly quick to calculate whatever desperate sum she found herself needing to calculate next. She was not a small woman in spirit, though she was slight in frame, and she wore a wool coat that had belonged to Thomas and was too wide in the shoulders, and still smelled faintly of him when the wind blew a certain way. The deed was for 212 acres of good Kansas prairie land, river access included. Thomas had filed on it 8 years ago under the Homestead Act, had proved it up, had paid his fees, had built a proper house with a stone foundation instead of the usual sod, and had left it to Alma free and clear when he died. That was the part that ought to have been simple. Except that a man named Harlan Fitch, who ran the land speculating operation out of the back room of the Caldwell Hotel, had somehow filed a competing claim through a loophole that Alma did not fully understand, and a county clerk who she suspected had been paid to look the other way. The competing claim said that Thomas had never completed his improvements to satisfaction, and that the land had reverted. Her deed said otherwise. She needed the bank manager, a man named Gerald Hoyt, to witness an affidavit confirming the original mortgage and payment history on the property, because that paperwork would support her deed in the territorial court proceeding that was now only 6 days away. And Gerald Hoyt had closed the bank today because of the snow. She had knocked 3 times. She had pressed her face against the cold glass of the window and seen the lamp still burning in the back office and knocked again. Nothing. She had been standing here for 20 minutes now, and she could no longer feel her feet properly, and she was starting to understand, in a way that felt physical rather than just emotional, what it meant to have no one left in the world who was obligated to help you. Her daughter, Clara, was 9 years old and was back at the farm in the care of their neighbor, old Mrs. Tanner, who was 67 and arthritic and had been a good friend to Alma, but could not help her in any legal sense. Thomas had no brothers. Alma's own family was in Ohio, and her father had died in the war, and her mother had remarried a man who had made clear that a widowed daughter with farmland debts was not a welcome addition to his household. She had written to her mother twice about the situation, and received back 2 letters full of sympathy and no practical assistance whatsoever. So Alma stood in the snow with her deed, and tried to think of one more thing she could do that she had not already tried. She was so deep inside her own head that she did not hear the boots on the boardwalk behind her. She heard only the wind and then a voice, low and steady and calm, coming from just over her left shoulder. "Not today," the voice said. She spun around fast, heart hammering, one hand gripping the deed harder and the other going instinctively to the small folding knife she kept in her coat pocket ever since Thomas died, because a woman alone on a farm learns quickly what it means to be without a man nearby. The person who had spoken was standing about 6 feet behind her, and he had both hands raised slightly at his sides in a gesture that was clearly meant to communicate that he was not a threat. He was tall, broad through the chest, with dark skin and dark eyes, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from something harder than wood. He wore a sheepskin coat and a wide-brimmed hat with snow on the brim, and there was a worn leather saddlebag over one shoulder and a badge pinned to the lapel of the coat beneath it. Not a sheriff's badge. A U.S. Deputy Marshal's badge, the silver catching what little light the gray sky was offering. "Not today," he said again, and his voice had a quality she could not immediately name, like something that was used to being heard without being raised. "Whatever it is you're thinking of doing next, not today. You look like a woman who's about to walk into something cold and deep without a rope tied to her." Alma stared at him. Her heart was still pounding. "I beg your pardon. I mean you look like you're about to give up," he said, still with the same calm, with the same hands slightly open at his sides. "I've been watching you knock on that door for the better part of 15 minutes from across the street, and I've got a feeling that whatever brought you out in this weather isn't the kind of thing that deserves to be given up on." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back at the closed door. Then she looked at him again. "The bank is closed," she said, which was both obvious and the only thing she could think to say. "I know it," he said. "Gerald Hoyt closes early when the snow gets above 3 inches. Always has. Used to frustrate my father something terrible when I was a boy." He paused. "Isaiah Hudson," he said, and held out one hand. She stared at the hand for a second, then shook it. His grip was warm and firm. "Alma Brooks," she said. "What do you need from inside that bank, Mrs. Brooks, if you don't mind my asking?" She almost said that she did mind. She almost said that it was none of his business and that she appreciated his concern, but she was fine, which would have been such a complete lie that the snow might have melted from the sheer heat of it. Instead, because she was exhausted and cold and had no more energy left for her pride, she told him. All of it. The deed, the competing claim, Harlan Fitch, the territorial court date 6 days away, Gerald Hoyt and his affidavit, her dead husband and her 9-year-old daughter, and 212 acres of Kansas prairie that she had no intention of handing over to a land speculator without a fight. Isaiah Hudson listened to all of it without interrupting once. He stood there in the snow with his hat getting whiter by the minute, and his dark eyes moving over her face with an expression she could not quite read, somewhere between professional attention and something more personal that she was probably imagining. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Gerald Hoyt doesn't go far when he closes early. He goes to the back room of the hotel, plays cards with the same 3 men he's been playing cards with for 11 years. "I know," Alma said, and hated that her voice came out sounding as tired as she felt. "I knocked there too. He said he was off duty and couldn't help me until the bank opened on Thursday." "Thursday," Isaiah repeated, and something shifted in his jaw. "And your court date is in 6 days." "Yes." "That's cutting it close. I'm aware." He looked at the door, he looked at her. He reached into the inside pocket of his sheepskin coat and produced something she recognized after a moment as a folded document with an official seal. "I happen to have legitimate federal business with Gerald Hoyt that I've been putting off because of this weather," he said. "Federal business has a way of opening doors that ordinary requests don't." She looked at him. "You would do that?" "I'm not doing it for charity," he said, and there was something in his voice that was entirely direct and without condescension, which she appreciated more than she could say. "I'm doing it because I'm a federal officer and I know Harlan Fitch's name, and what I know about Harlan Fitch and the county clerk's office in this territory would fill a report I've been trying to complete for 4 months. Your situation and my investigation may happen to be pointing at the same problem." She studied him. "You're investigating Fitch." "I'm investigating land fraud in Sumner County," he said carefully. "Fitch is a name that comes up with some regularity." It was the first time in 8 months that Alma had felt something that was not grief or fear or exhausted determination. What she felt now was something cautious and tentative, and she was not entirely sure what to call it. She called it hope because that was the least frightening available name. "All right," she said. "Lead the way, Marshal." Gerald Hoyt was in the back room of the Caldwell Hotel, as Isaiah had predicted, with his coat off and his sleeves rolled and a hand of cards that he did not look happy to set down. He was a soft man, round at the middle and thin at the top, with the kind of expression that suggested he had spent his entire professional life making himself slightly unavailable whenever anything complicated presented itself. He looked at Isaiah's badge, and then at the federal document Isaiah set on the table in front of him, and then at Alma, and then back at Isaiah, and something in his face went through 3 or 4 different calculations before landing on resigned cooperation. "I'm not officially on duty," Hoyt said. "No," Isaiah agreed pleasantly. "But your bank is the depository of record for the Brooks homestead loan, and I'm going to need you to confirm the original filing date and payment history as part of a federal inquiry, and I'd prefer to do that tonight rather than tomorrow, because tomorrow I ride to Wichita, and I'd hate to have to send a formal summons back down here when we could just handle it over the next 20 minutes. Hoyt looked at his cards. He set them face down on the table. He picked up his coat. 23 minutes later, Alma had a signed and witnessed affidavit confirming that Thomas Brooks had taken out a homestead improvement loan on the property in 1870, had paid it in full by 1874, and that the bank's records showed no default or lapse at any point in the history of the filing. Hoyt had signed it with the slightly martyred expression of a man doing the right thing against his natural preference, and Alma had taken the document with both hands and held it against her chest for a moment before folding it carefully inside her coat. When they stepped back out onto the street, the snow was still falling but more gently now, and the light was failing, and Alma realized she had been in Caldwell for nearly 4 hours and had not eaten since early morning. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it in a way she was not sure she was able to fully convey in 2 words but tried anyway. Isaiah was pulling on his gloves. He looked at her with those dark eyes and said, "You have somewhere to stay tonight. You can't ride 14 miles back in the dark in this weather." "I hadn't thought about that," she admitted, which was true. She had been so focused on the deed and the affidavit that she had not made arrangements. "The hotel has a women's room," he said. $2 a night, clean enough." "I know it," she said. She did. She just wasn't sure she wanted to spend $2 she needed for filing fees. He seemed to read her hesitation with an accuracy that was slightly alarming. "They'll also let you pay when you leave in the morning," he said. "I know the woman at the desk. She's reasonable." Alma looked at him. "You know everyone in this town," she said. "I grew up here," he said simply. "Moved away at 19 to join the Marshal service. Came back on assignment 6 months ago. I know everyone, and they've all had 15 years to form opinions of me that are not easy to revise." There was something underneath those words that she noticed but did not press on. It was the kind of statement that contained a whole private history, and she had her own private history to carry without borrowing someone else's. "I'll take the room," she said, "and I'll be on the road by first light." He nodded. Then he said, "There's a dining room in the hotel. I was going to eat there tonight." He paused, and she could see him choosing his words in a way that was careful and deliberate. "You're welcome to join me if you'd like. No obligation, just a meal." She looked at him for a long moment. The snow was settling on both of them, and the lamplight from the hotel window was warm and yellow against the dark street, and she was cold and hungry, and she realized with some surprise she did not actually want to eat alone. "All right," she said. "Just a meal." The dining room was warm and smelled of roasted meat and wood smoke, and they sat across from each other at a table near the fire and ate beef stew and cornbread and drank coffee that was strong enough to stand a spoon in. Alma watched Isaiah Hudson over the rim of her cup and thought about what she knew and what she didn't. What she knew was that he was a U.S. Deputy Marshal, that he had grown up in Caldwell, that he had a federal document he hadn't been obligated to use on her behalf but had used anyway, and that he listened when she talked the way very few people had ever listened to her, with his full attention rather than the distracted half-attention she had come to expect from most men, which suggested he was either professionally trained to do so or was genuinely interested, or both. What she didn't know was almost everything else. "How long have you been a marshal?" she asked, because it was a safe enough question. 11 years, he said. Started as a deputy out of Fort Smith, moved to the Wichita district 4 years ago, came down to Caldwell when the land fraud cases started picking up. Sumner County has a particular problem right now with speculators and corrupt filing clerks, and I've been building cases for the better part of a year. Is Fitch going to prison? She asked. He's going to be very unhappy for the foreseeable future, Isaiah said, which was not a direct answer but was said with enough quiet certainty that she found it more reassuring than a direct answer might have been. He's been pressuring me to sell, she said. 2 letters and a visit from one of his men. The man who visited said things that were meant to frighten me. She said it flatly, without drama, because it was simply a fact. Isaiah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. What kind of things? That land was not a suitable place for a woman alone. That accidents happened on farms that weren't properly maintained by a capable person. That Clara and I might find ourselves in a difficult situation come spring if we hadn't made sensible arrangements. She looked at her coffee. He didn't say anything that could be held against him directly. He was careful about that. They're always careful, Isaiah said, and there was something in his voice now that was not quite anger but was adjacent to it, controlled and directed inward. I'd like you to tell me the exact date of that visit and the name of the man if you know it, because that goes directly into my report. I wrote it down, she said, which surprised him slightly. She could see it in his expression. I started keeping a journal of everything that happened after the competing claim was filed. Dates, names, what was said. Thomas always kept detailed records, and I thought it was a good habit. Isaiah looked at her with an expression that she could not read at first and then could. It was respect, straightforward and unguarded. That journal is going to be useful, he said. I had hoped it might be. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes. The fire popped. A group of cowboys at the next table argued amiably about the price of cattle. Somewhere down the hall a piano was being played with more enthusiasm than skill. You said you grew up here, Alma said eventually. Your father was frustrated by Hoyt closing the bank early. My father ran a freight operation, Isaiah said. Had contracts with 3 of the big ranches in the county. He did well for a number of years. He paused. Then the contracts started getting pulled. New haulers coming in who were willing to undercut the prices. Strange things happening to the wagons. 2 of the horses getting sick at once. He said all of it evenly. He never could prove any of it was deliberate. He died thinking he had simply failed. Alma was quiet for a moment. But you didn't believe he had failed. No, Isaiah said. I believed someone had helped him fail. And when I was old enough to do something about it, I made a career out of finding people who help other people fail. He said this without self-pity and without performance, as a simple statement of the trajectory of his life, and Alma found it both devastating and entirely comprehensible. She thought about Thomas, who had not been helped to fail by anyone in particular but had simply worked himself to the edge of his strength and then beyond it, and who had died in the South Field without anyone nearby to help him, and who had left her with good land and a good daughter, and no good way to hold on to either if men like Fitch had their way. I'm sorry about your father, she said. I'm sorry about your husband, he said. They looked at each other across the table and neither of them said anything more for a moment, and the fire was warm and the coffee was strong, and outside the snow was still falling on the Kansas prairie, and Alma Brooks felt, for the first time in 8 months, something that was not quite loneliness. She left early the next morning as she had said she would, the affidavit wrapped in oilcloth inside her coat. Her horse fed and rested from the livery stable where Isaiah had quietly arranged her a discounted rate by speaking to the owner. A favor she had accepted with more grace than she felt, because she needed the money, and there was no point in pride when the court date was 6 days away. She rode home through a landscape that was white and clean and bitterly cold, and she thought about a tall man with a deputy marshal's badge and a careful voice, and a story about his father that had landed somewhere soft and permanent inside her chest. She told herself she would probably not see him again, and that this was fine. The days before the court proceeding were the longest of Alma's life since the days immediately following Thomas's death. She prepared everything she had. She organized the deed, the bank affidavit, her personal journal with its careful dates and names, a letter from a neighboring homesteader named Clement Webb who had witnessed Thomas filing his original claim, and a signed statement from Mrs. Tanner confirming the continuous occupation and improvement of the property. She worked by lamplight long after Clara was asleep, cross-referencing dates and checking the territorial filing regulations that she had obtained from the courthouse in Wichita by mail the previous month. Clara, who was 9 and possessed of a seriousness that she had inherited from Thomas and a stubbornness that was entirely her own, sat at the kitchen table the night before the proceeding and watched her mother work. "Are we going to keep the farm?" Clara asked. Alma looked up. Her daughter had Thomas's brown eyes and her own dark auburn hair and a set to her chin that Alma found equal parts heartbreaking and encouraging. "Yes," Alma said, "we are." "How do you know?" "Because I have done everything that can be done," Alma said, "and I am not going to let anyone take what your father built." Clara considered this with the gravity that only 9-year-olds bring to fundamental questions. "Papa would be proud of you," she said. Alma had to look back at her papers for a moment because her eyes were doing something she could not afford to let them do the night before a court proceeding. "Go to bed, sweetheart," she said. "I'm not tired." That was not a request. Clara went. The territorial land hearing was held in the courthouse in Caldwell, which was a drafty stone building that smelled of damp wool and cold paper. The judge was a man named Bertram Olds, who had the face and manner of someone who had been enormously disappointed by humanity for several decades and had developed a professional tolerance for this condition. He sat at the bench with his reading glasses and a stack of documents and an expression that revealed nothing. Harlan Fitch was there with a lawyer from Wichita, an oiled and polished man named Creighton who wore a suit that cost more than Alma's horse. Fitch himself was a lean man in his 50s with a silver mustache and the kind of pale eyes that always seemed to be calculating the distance between himself and something he wanted. He looked at Alma when she came in, and his expression was precisely calibrated to suggest that he felt sympathy for her, which made her want to do something she was too well raised to do. Alma had no lawyer. She had her documents and herself. She was sitting at the petitioner's table arranging her papers when the door at the back of the courtroom opened, and she heard boots on the wooden floor and turned without entirely meaning to. Isaiah Hudson walked to the front of the room, removed his hat, and stopped at the clerk's desk. He presented a federal document to the clerk, spoke quietly for a moment, and then the clerk went to Judge Olds, and there was a brief, low conversation that Alma could not hear but could see the effect of. Judge Olds looked at the document, looked at Isaiah, looked at Fitch's lawyer with an expression that had sharpened considerably, and made a note. Isaiah took a seat in the gallery, not at either table. He caught Alma's eye and gave her one small, level nod, which communicated nothing except perhaps that he was there, which was somehow everything. Harlan Fitch's lawyer presented the competing claim with considerable rhetorical polish. He invoked the territorial homestead improvement standards and argued that independent assessors had found the Brooks property lacking in several categories, and that under the territorial regulations, the reversion filing had been entirely proper and legally executed. Alma presented her deed, the bank affidavit from Gerald Hoyt, Clement Webb's letter, Mrs. Tanner's statement, and her journal. She spoke clearly and without ornament, citing page numbers and dates, correcting 3 factual inaccuracies in the lawyer's presentation, with the precise chapter and verse of the documentation that contradicted them. She watched Judge Olds's face while she spoke. His expression remained neutral, but his pencil was moving. When she was done, the lawyer made several objections that Judge Olds overruled one by one with the efficiency of a man who had made up his mind about something and was working through the procedural requirements before he could say so. Then Judge Olds looked at the back of the room and said, "Deputy Marshal Hudson." Your documentation suggests a federal interest in these proceedings. Would you like to address the court? Isaiah stood. He spoke for 8 minutes. He described, with specificity and documentation, a pattern of competing claims filed through the Sumner County Clerk's office over the preceding 3 years, 17 of them, all in properties adjacent to proposed railroad expansion routes, all filed using the same interpretation of the improvement standards, all benefiting the same group of associated land speculators, of which Harlan Fitch was a principal member. He noted that the county clerk who had processed 12 of the 17 filings was currently under federal investigation and had, 2 weeks prior, been suspended from his duties. He said that the Brooks filing followed this pattern precisely, and that the federal investigation had produced substantial evidence that the original assessor's report had been falsified. Harlan Fitch was very still during this presentation. His lawyer made 2 objections. Both were overruled. Judge Olds looked at his documents for a long moment after Isaiah sat down. Then he looked at Fitch. Then he looked at Alma. The deed held by Alma Brooks represents a valid and continuous claim under the Homestead Act of 1862, he said. The competing claim filed by associated interests of Harlan Fitch is dismissed with prejudice. The Brooks property is confirmed in the petitioner's name, free and clear of all competing claims. Costs of these proceedings are to be borne by the party whose claim has been dismissed. He banged his gavel. Next case. Alma sat very still for a moment. Then she folded her hands on the table and breathed. Behind her, she heard Fitch say something to his lawyer in a low, tight voice. She did not look at him. She gathered her papers, each one carefully, and put them back in their oilcloth envelope and stood up, and only then did she let herself feel the relief, which was so large it nearly took her legs out from under her. Isaiah was at the door when she walked out. He was holding his hat, and he looked at her face, and something in his own face changed, something warm and slightly unguarded. "Well," he said, though she suspected he already knew from the look of her. "We keep the farm," she said. He smiled then, and it transformed his face so completely that she stood staring at it like she had never seen a smile before. It was not a small smile or a careful smile. It was the kind that started at the eyes and took its time getting to the mouth, and once it arrived it was entirely genuine. "I know," he said. "I talked to Olds last week." "Last week," she repeated. "I went to see him with the federal documentation before the hearing. It was important that he had context." He said it simply, as a matter of procedure, but she saw through the procedural explanation to the thing underneath it, which was that he had done this deliberately and ahead of time, and had not told her because he had not wanted to give her false certainty. She looked at him for a moment. The courthouse steps were cold, and the main street of Caldwell was busy with its usual commerce, and behind them she could hear Judge Olds already proceeding to the next case, and she was aware that she was standing in public in the middle of the day and probably should not be looking at Isaiah Hudson the way she was currently looking at Isaiah Hudson. "Thank you," she said, which was woefully insufficient, and she knew it. "You won it," he said. "Your documents won it. I just made sure the right context was in the right place at the right time. That is a significant thing to have done." "It is considerably less significant than what you've been doing alone for the past 8 months, he said, and the directness of it caught her completely unprepared. She looked away, down the street. A buckboard was passing, loaded with winter supplies. 2 cowboys from one of the big ranches were leaning against the post outside the general store arguing about something that was probably horses. The sun was making an effort at the clouds and not entirely succeeding. "I should get back to the farm," she said. "Mrs. Tanner is with Clara." "Of course," he said. He put his hat back on. He seemed about to say something else and then reconsidered it. "Are you riding back alone?" "I've been riding back alone for 8 months, she pointed out. "You have," he said. "I just wondered if you'd mind some company as far as the county road. I've got reason to go out that direction." She looked at him. She was quite sure that his reason to go out in that direction was approximately as urgent as her reason to spend 2 hours in a snowstorm looking at a closed door had been productive. She was equally sure that she did not mind. "If you're going that way anyway," she said. They rode side by side through the winter afternoon, their horses finding their footing on the packed snow of the road, and they talked. Not about the case or the hearing or Fitch, but about other things. Isaiah told her about Fort Smith and the cases he had worked there, not the violent ones but the strange ones, the intricate frauds and tangled disputes that required patience more than anything else. She told him about Ohio and the farm she had grown up on, and how she had come west with Thomas at 23, because Thomas had believed that the West was where a man could actually get somewhere, which had turned out to be true in the ways that mattered even if it had also been very hard. She told him about Clara. She found that she wanted to talk about Clara to him, because he listened to everything about Clara with the same complete attention he gave everything else, asking questions that showed he had retained the previous answer and was building on it, which was the kind of listening that made a person want to keep talking. He told her that he had never married. He said it without apparent embarrassment, and without the slightly defensive quality that men often brought to that admission, just as a fact about his life. He had been engaged once briefly at 26 to a woman in Fort Smith who had decided after 4 months that a man who was gone 6 weeks out of 8 was not a man she wanted to wait for, and he had thought she was probably right and had not argued about it. "You didn't argue," Alma said. "She wasn't wrong," he said. "I was gone 6 weeks out of 8. That's a hard life for someone." "It's a hard life for both people," Alma said. He looked at her sideways from under the brim of his hat. "Yes," he said, "it is." They reached the county road and he stopped his horse and she stopped hers, and they were side by side in the cold afternoon light with the snow around them clean and white in every direction. "I'll be in Caldwell for another 4 to 6 months," he said, "until the federal case is concluded. After that I don't know where the service will send me." She nodded. This was a practical statement of his situation and she received it as such. "What happens to Fitch?" she asked. "The federal charges will be filed within the month," he said. "He'll likely face trial in the spring." Several of the men he worked with have already indicated a willingness to cooperate with the investigation in exchange for reduced charges. He paused. "I want to be honest with you that federal proceedings can be slow and outcomes are not guaranteed, but the evidence is substantial." "I appreciate the honesty," she said. "I try to be honest as a general practice," he said. "It causes some problems but fewer than the alternative." She smiled at that. It was the first time she had smiled properly in longer than she could quickly calculate, and she felt it in her face as something unfamiliar and slightly unpracticed, like a skill she had let go rusty. He noticed. She could see him notice, and the thing that happened to his face when he noticed was something she was going to think about during the 14-mile ride home and probably for some time after that. "Mrs. Brooks," he said and stopped. "Alma," she said. "You've done enough to earn the first name." "Alma," he said, and the word in his mouth had a quality she wasn't prepared for, careful and warm at once. "If it wouldn't be improper to ask, when the weather clears some and the roads are better, I'd like to call on you and Clara, if that would be agreeable." She looked at him for a long moment. The horses stood patiently in the cold. The sky was the particular blue of winter afternoon that you only got in Kansas, vast and flat and going on forever. "It would be agreeable," she said, "though I should warn you that Clara will want to know everything about you and will ask questions without the diplomatic softening that adults usually apply." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "I spent 4 years in Fort Smith," he said. "I can handle a 9-year-old." "You haven't met this particular 9-year-old," Alma said. He did come. 3 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon in mid-February when the worst of the winter had pulled back enough to make the roads passable, Isaiah Hudson rode up to the Brooks property on a gray mare and stood at the gate and called out a hello before coming through, which she appreciated more than she could easily articulate because some men simply walked through gates like the world was a door they owned. The farm was exactly what she had described and nothing more. A stone house that Thomas had built with more care than skill, but which had held through 4 Kansas winters. A barn that was weathered but sound. A chicken coop. A vegetable garden under snow. 2 fields that would be planted in spring if she could get through to spring. A milk cow named Hester who had opinions about strangers. Clara met him at the door with her arms crossed and an expression that Alma recognized as her serious face, which was Clara's default position when encountering new information. "Are you a lawman?" Clara asked, by way of greeting. "I am," Isaiah said, crouching down to her level with a naturalness that was not performed. "U.S. Deputy Marshal, Isaiah Hudson." "My mother said you helped with the court thing," Clara said. "Your mother helped with the court thing," he said. "I just made sure some people had the information they needed." Clara studied him. "Do you carry a gun?" "I do." "Can I see it?" "Clara," Alma said from behind her. "No," Isaiah said straightforwardly and without apology. "Not today. But I'll tell you how it works if you're interested. Because understanding how things work is generally more useful than just looking at them." Clara considered this for approximately 3 seconds and then stepped aside from the door, which was apparently consent to enter. He stayed for 3 hours. Alma made coffee and put out the cornbread she had baked that morning, and Clara interrogated him about the Marshal's service with the systematic thoroughness of a prosecuting attorney, and Isaiah answered every question with complete seriousness and no trace of condescension, which earned him Clara's provisional respect, which was more than most adults managed in a first encounter. Then Clara demanded that he see the barn because Hester had recently developed a tendency to kick the west wall at odd hours and nobody could figure out why. And Isaiah looked at the wall in question with the same focused attention he brought to everything, and said there were probably field mice getting in through a gap in the foundation stones. And Clara looked at him with enormous respect and said that was exactly what she had told her mother, and her mother had said it might be something else. Alma said she had never said any such thing, and Clara said she had said it might be the boards settling, and Isaiah, very carefully, did not smile. When he was leaving, Clara had gone in to wash up for supper, and Alma walked him to the gate because it was polite and also because she was not in any particular hurry to end the afternoon. The light was going gold in the west the way it did on February evenings when the sky was clear and the snow had a pink edge to it, and it was cold but not unpleasantly so. "She's remarkable," Isaiah said at the gate. "She is," Alma agreed. "She is also capable of wearing a person entirely flat within about an hour, so I appreciate your endurance." "I liked it," he said simply, and she believed him. He stood at the gate with the reins in his hand and looked at her with those dark eyes that she had been thinking about for 3 weeks, and she looked back, and neither of them said anything for a moment that was longer than a moment. "Can I come again?" he asked. "Yes," she said. He came again 2 weeks after that, and again 2 weeks after that, and each time he came Alma found herself thinking in the days before his arrival about things she wanted to tell him, things she had read or thought or noticed, not because she was performing for him, but because he was the kind of person you accumulated observations for, the kind of person who would understand why a particular thing had struck you as significant or funny or strange. March came in raw and wet, and then warmer, and the ground began to soften, and Alma was thinking about planting. She had to be practical about what she could do alone. Thomas had always done the plowing with the old draft horse, a gray roan named Atticus who had died the previous autumn at 22 years old, and she had not been able to afford another draft horse, and she was trying to work out how she could hire Clement Webb's boy to do the plowing in exchange for something she could actually offer. When Isaiah rode up on a Saturday morning with a draft horse hitched to a borrowed plow that he had apparently arranged from someone on the edge of town, she stood on the porch and looked at this. "I'm not a charity case," she said. "I know it," he said from the saddle of his gray mare. "I'm also not offering charity." Harlan Fitch's former associate, a man named Douglas Pryor, who was one of the cooperating witnesses in the federal case, identified your property specifically as one that had been targeted. I feel a professional obligation to ensure that the corrective measures taken on behalf of that target are as complete as possible." He said this with complete seriousness, and she could see he was trying not to smile. She looked at the draft horse. She looked at the plow. She looked at him. "That is an extremely elaborate justification for being neighborly," she said. "I try to do things properly," he said. She helped him with the plowing, because she was not going to stand and watch while he worked her land. They plowed together through the morning, Isaiah with the draft horse and Alma breaking up clods behind with a hand tool, and they talked the way they had been talking on his visits, easily and without the careful management of impression that Alma remembered from her courtship with Thomas 14 years ago, which had been charming in its awkwardness but had required a great deal of energy. This was different. This was the kind of talking that didn't require energy, that gave it back instead. By noon they had finished 2 of the 4 fields, and they sat on the porch steps with water, and the biscuits that Clara had made that morning with more ambition than Thomas had ever brought to baking, and approximately the same skill level as the piano player at the Caldwell Hotel. Clara sat between them, working through a biscuit with the determination of someone who made a thing, and was going to eat it regardless of the outcome. "Isaiah," Clara said, because she had moved to the first name approximately 40 minutes into his second visit, "when you catch bad men, what do you do with them?" "We bring them to the court," he said. "And then what?" "And then the court decides what happens to them. And if the court gets it wrong," Isaiah looked at her. "That's an important question," he said. "The court gets it wrong sometimes. That's one of the reasons we keep working to improve how courts operate and who sits on them and what evidence they'll consider." Clara thought about this. "That's slow," she said. "It is," he agreed. "Most of the important things are." Clara went inside after the biscuit, announcing that she was going to check on Hester, and Alma and Isaiah sat on the porch steps in the March sunshine, and the silence settled between them comfortably as it always did. "She asked me last week if you were going to be her new father," Alma said, and immediately regretted saying it because she had not entirely planned to say it, but it was out now and she had never been good at taking things back. Isaiah was quiet for a moment. When she made herself look at him, his expression was not alarmed or uncomfortable. It was something more careful and serious than that. "What did you tell her?" he said. "I told her that you were a friend and that was something to be valued for itself," Alma said. He nodded. He looked at the fields they had just turned and then at the sky and then back at her. "She's not wrong to ask," he said. "In her position, it's a reasonable question." Alma felt her heart doing something complicated. "Isaiah, I'm not going to say anything that you're not ready to hear," he said quietly. "But I want you to know that I don't come out here on Saturdays because of professional obligation or because I have extra time and nothing to do with it. I come because I want to be here. And I want to be here because of you and because of Clara, and because this porch and those fields and that terrible barn cat who knocked my hat off last week." She laughed at that, genuinely, unexpectedly. "Because all of it feels like something I don't want to ride away from." She looked at her hands in her lap. The sun was warm on her face. "It's been less than 3 months," she said. "I know it," he said. "I'm not in a hurry. I just wanted to be honest because I said I try to be honest." She looked up at him. His face was open and steady and looked exactly like the man she had come to know through these weeks, someone who thought carefully and spoke carefully and did things because he had thought about them first rather than because an impulse had moved him. It was a face she trusted. It was more than that and she knew it, but it was at minimum a face she trusted completely. "I think," she said slowly, "that I need more time. Not because I don't," she started again. "Not because there isn't something here, but because I am not the person I was before Thomas died and I haven't finished working out who the person I am now actually is. And I don't want to give any part of myself to anyone before I know what I have to give." He nodded. His face showed nothing except understanding, which was the right response, and she was almost undone by how entirely right it was. "Take whatever time you need," he said. I'll be here." Spring came to the Brooks property with the suddenness it always had in Kansas, as if winter simply decided one morning to stop being an argument, and the world leapt into color before anyone had quite prepared for it. The fields that she and Isaiah had plowed in March were planted by April with corn and winter wheat, and she hired Clement Webb's boy after all for the heavier mechanical work, and paid him in produce and 2 days of Isaiah's assistance fixing the Webb family's fence line, an arrangement that Isaiah had proposed, and which Clement Webb had accepted with the equanimity of a man who appreciated a practical solution. Alma watched Isaiah work alongside the Webb boy one afternoon from the edge of the property, and thought about what she had said to him on the porch steps in March, and whether she had been telling him the truth or telling herself a story about why she was afraid. She had been afraid. She could be honest about that. She was afraid of needing someone and having them die. She was afraid of building something again and watching it come apart. She was afraid that the way she felt when Isaiah Hudson walked onto her property, the particular quality of the relief and the warmth and the specific kind of attention she gave to him that she did not give to anything else, she was afraid that all of that was just loneliness wearing a convenient face. But loneliness didn't make you want to tell someone every small thing you noticed during the week between his visits. Loneliness didn't make you feel, when he looked at you, like the version of yourself that you most respected was the version he saw. Loneliness was a wanting without a direction. What she felt had a very specific direction, and it was wearing a sheepskin coat and arguing with Clement Webb's boy about the correct angle for a fence post. She made a decision the way she made most important decisions, quietly and without fanfare, inside herself before she said it out loud to anyone. The trial of Harlan Fitch and 3 of his associates began in April in Wichita, and Isaiah was in the city for most of the month, which was the longest stretch he had been away since January. He wrote letters, which was not something she had expected, precise and warm letters that were written in a clear hand, and described the proceedings with the same careful detail he brought to everything, and that always ended with something personal, a line or two that was not case summary but was him, what he was thinking about when the day was done, and he was sitting in his hotel room in Wichita. He wrote about the sunsets over the Arkansas River. He wrote about a conversation he'd had with an old Cherokee man who sold tobacco near the courthouse steps, and who had told him something about patience that he was still turning over. He wrote about Clara's biscuits in a way that was so affectionate and funny that she had to read it twice. She wrote back. She wrote about the farm, the fields, the particular magnificence of May in Kansas when everything that had been dead for months came back with a kind of fervor. The way Clara had started keeping her own journal, because she had heard that Alma's journal had been useful in court, and had decided this was a skill worth having. The way Hester had made her opinion of the new fence clear by ignoring it completely, and standing exactly where the old fence had been as if she could will it back into existence through sheer bovine stubbornness. She wrote that she missed him, which she had not entirely planned to write, and which she left in the letter anyway because it was true, and she had promised herself she would not run from true things. He came back in May with the Fitch trial concluded. Fitch had been convicted on 4 of 6 charges, including conspiracy to defraud and filing false government documents, and was sentenced to 4 years in the federal penitentiary. 2 of his associates had received reduced sentences in exchange for their cooperation. The county clerk who had processed the fraudulent filings had been removed from office and was facing his own proceedings. Isaiah described all of this in the first letter he had written on his way back to Caldwell, and then he was standing at her gate on a Saturday morning in May when the farm was green and the air smelled of new growth, and he looked, she thought, exactly right standing in that gate, like he had always been going to end up exactly there. Clara ran out to meet him, which she had not done on his first several visits, and which told Alma more than Clara probably intended. He brought Clara a book about natural history from a shop in Wichita, and Clara received it with the reverence she reserved for things she genuinely loved, which was not many things. He brought Alma a small jar of good coffee from the same city, because he had mentioned in a letter that the Caldwell supply had been poor quality lately, and he had thought of her when he found a better grade. It was such a practical and thoughtful gift that she had to do something useful with her hands for a moment before she could respond. They sat on the porch in the May warmth with good coffee, while Clara sat in the yard with her book and read with the complete absorption she brought to things that interested her. And Alma told herself she was going to say the thing she had been working up to since March, and she was going to say it now. "I've been thinking," she said. "I know," he said. "I could tell from the letters." She looked at him. "You could tell from the letters. You write differently when you're working something out," he said. "More questions at the end of things. The letter about the sunsets." He paused. "I recognized it because I write the same way." She breathed in. The air was warm and green-smelling, and the farm was alive around her in every direction, and Clara was in the yard reading about natural history, and this was her life, hers, that she had fought for and kept, and she had enough of herself now to know what she wanted to do with it. "I wrote that I missed you," she said. "You did," he said. "I meant it more than I wrote it," she said. "I've been thinking since March about whether what I feel is real in the way I need it to be real before I can trust it, and I've decided that it is." She looked at him directly. "I've decided that you are someone I want in my life, not as a Saturday visitor, as something that matters. I'm not saying everything at once, I'm just saying that." He was looking at her with an expression that she had not seen on his face before, something that was not guarded at all, that was completely open in a way that made him look younger and entirely certain at the same time. "Alma," he said, and stopped. "I know you might not be stationed in Caldwell much longer," she said, because she had thought about this too, and it was a real consideration, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. "I know the service sends you where they send you. I know that whatever this is, it comes with complications." "It does," he said. "I won't pretend it doesn't, but I'm not a man who uses complications as an excuse to walk away from something he wants." He reached across the space between them and took her hand, carefully, the way he did everything, giving her time to pull back if she wanted to. She didn't want to. "I have wanted to be where you are since January," he said. "Since you were standing in the snow outside that bank with your deed and your spine straight and your hands frozen, and you turned around and looked at me like I might be either an answer or a threat, and you weren't going to be afraid of either." She felt her throat go tight. "I was afraid," she said. "I know you were," he said. "That's the part that got me. You were afraid and you stood there anyway." She turned her hand over in his and held it. Clara looked up from her book across the yard and looked at them for approximately 1 second, and then looked back at her book with the precision of a child who had decided. She had not seen anything she was going to comment on, which was its own kind of endorsement. They went slowly, because Alma was a practical woman and Isaiah was a careful man, and they both understood that the heart was not a thing to be rushed in a direction it wasn't ready to go. But slow in this case was not the same as uncertain. Every Sunday he came, and sometimes a Saturday too, and the farm knew his presence the way it knew hers, comfortably and without surprise. He helped when she needed help, and did not help when she did not ask for it. He talked to Clara about everything from natural history to the mechanics of the federal court system, to why crows were smarter than most people gave them credit for. And Clara formed an attachment that she expressed entirely through giving him the hardest jobs on the property whenever he arrived, which Isaiah appeared to consider an honor. In July he rode in on a Tuesday, which was not his usual day, and she was in the garden pulling weeds, and she stood up and looked at him and knew immediately from the set of his face that something had changed. "They're transferring me," he said. "Not immediately. End of September. They want me in the Indian Territory, Muskogee District. The federal work there is significant and they need experienced officers." She pulled off her gardening gloves. The July sun was hot and straight overhead, and the corn was over her head in the south field, and everything was as exactly right as it had been 6 months ago when everything had been exactly wrong. "Muskogee," she said. "It's a good district," he said. "Important work. The kind I've wanted to be doing." He paused. "It's also 400 miles from this porch." She looked at him, he looked at her. Between them was every conversation they'd had, and every Saturday, and the letters, and the plowing, and Clara's natural history book, and the terrible biscuits, and Hester standing where the old fence had been. And she was not going to pretend that 400 miles was a small thing, or that she could just fold this up and put it away and go back to only herself. "Do you want to take the position?" she asked. "I want to know what you want," he said. She shook her head. "That's not fair, and you know it." "I asked you a question." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "It's the kind of work I've been building toward for 11 years. I want it." Another pause. "And I want this. And I know those two things are a problem." Alma looked at the garden. She looked at the south field. She looked at the stone house with the solid foundation that Thomas had built with more care than skill. She had stayed here. She had fought to stay here. This land was hers and Clara's, and she was not going to pretend that it wasn't or that it didn't matter. She was also not going to pretend that she had spent the last 7 months discovering what it felt like to have Isaiah Hudson in her life, and was now capable of simply subtracting him from the equation. "Ask me the question," she said. He blinked. "What?" "The question that you came here on a Tuesday to ask," she said. "Not the transfer, the other question." Something moved across his face, surprise, and something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to it. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "Will you marry me, Alma Brooks? And will you come to Muskogee with me, or will I find a way to come back here? Or will we work out something neither of us has thought of yet? I don't have a specific plan. I have a specific feeling, and I have a specific question, and I'm asking it." She looked at him. The sun was hot and the corn was high, and somewhere in the barn Hester was expressing an opinion about something in her usual resonant way. "Yes," Alma said, "to the question. The specifics will work out." He crossed the garden to her in 2 strides, and she didn't step back, and when he put his hands on her face and looked at her, she felt the same thing she had been feeling since January, warm and certain and absolutely real. And she kissed him in her garden in the July sun with dirt on her hands and her hair coming out of its pins. And if there was a better place and time to make that particular decision, she could not imagine what it would have been. Clara, appearing from nowhere with the sudden omnipresence of 9-year-olds who are paying close attention to everything that seems important, stood at the edge of the garden and said, "I knew it," in a tone of profound satisfaction. Isaiah laughed, which was a sound Alma had not heard enough of and intended to change. They were married in September on the farm, by the circuit preacher who came through Caldwell on the 3rd Sunday of every month. It was a small ceremony because they were practical people, and neither of them needed a large occasion to mean it. Mrs. Tanner came, and Clement Webb and his family, and Gerald Hoyt came with the sheepish expression of a man who knew he was benefiting from having been on the right side of something he had initially resisted. The judge, Bertram Olds, sent a brief note of congratulation that was so carefully worded as to convey almost nothing while somehow conveying goodwill, which was probably what many years on the bench did to a person's correspondence. Clara was the one who declared the ceremony satisfactorily concluded by saying, very seriously, "Now he has to stay," which made everyone laugh, and which was the truest thing said all day. The question of Muskogee had been worked out in the way that neither of them had thought of yet. Isaiah had spoken at length with his supervising marshal, a man named Archer, and had explained the situation with a directness that Alma suspected was unusual but not surprising coming from him. The result was that Isaiah would take the Muskogee position but would be permitted, given the nature of the work and the value he represented to the service, to structure his assignments in rotating periods, 6 weeks in the territory and 2 weeks at home, which was not perfect but was considerably better than 400 miles with no plan. The farm they arranged differently from how it had been. Alma hired Clement Webb's boy, whose name was James, and who was 18 and more capable than she had given him credit for, to manage the heavy work in Isaiah's absences. She paid him a proper wage, which she could afford now because the farm was producing well, and because Fitch's conviction had settled a number of related claims in the county, and she had been able to access a small federal restitution that the court had ordered as part of the fraud settlement. She would not give up the farm. She had been clear about that, and Isaiah had been clear that he would not ask her to. The farm was hers and Clara's, and now his too, and the work of building it into something that could support a family properly was the work she intended to do. Isaiah came back from his first Muskogee rotation in November with a report of the territory that was so detailed and carefully observed that she suspected he had been composing it for her the entire 6 weeks. And she read it in the evenings while he was back home the same way she had once read the letters from Wichita, with the full attention of a person who was genuinely interested in the world the other person was describing. Clara, who had added Isaiah's job to the list of subjects she was systematically studying, demanded a full accounting of the federal court system in Indian Territory and received it over the course of 3 evenings around the kitchen table. And it was during one of those evenings that Alma looked across the table at her daughter and her husband with the lamp between them and thought about January, standing in the snow outside the closed bank with her deed in her frozen hands. And how entirely impossible this moment would have seemed from that one. It was not that the hard things were gone. The hard things were structural to the life they were building. Isaiah's absences were real, and she felt them, and she was honest with him about feeling them when he came home, and he was honest that the work pulled at him the way work you care about always does, and that the pulling was not comfortable. Clara at 9 was easy in some ways and complicated in others, and at 10 she became easier and more complicated in different ways, as children reliably do. The farm had a drought scare the following summer that scared them genuinely before the rains came. James Webb broke his arm in August, and she spent 2 weeks doing more physical labor than she had done since Thomas died, and she was tired in a bone-deep way that she had hoped was behind her. But none of it was as frightening as January had been, standing alone in the snow. None of it was as frightening as not having anyone to come home to. And none of it, not the droughts or the absences or the bone-deep tiredness, none of it had the quality of despair that had followed her through the 8 months after Thomas died, when she had been entirely alone with a weight she was not sure she could carry. She was not alone now. By the 2nd year of their marriage, the farm had expanded. She had purchased the adjacent 40 acres that had been part of Fitch's original target, bought them at the federal auction following the settlement proceedings at a price that was fair, and that she had been able to meet because the farm was profitable, and because Isaiah had insisted on combining their financial circumstances properly rather than maintaining them as separate. Which was not legally required, but which he had said was simply what he intended in a marriage, and which she had agreed to with a practicality that she suspected he found charming. 252 acres now, river access on the south end. The south field that Thomas had died in was now the most productive field on the property, which she found alternately painful and right, because Thomas had loved that field and would have been pleased at what it was yielding. In the spring of the 2nd year, she told Isaiah that she was expecting. She told him on a Sunday morning in March, which was fitting given the first March they had known each other, and he was standing in the kitchen in his shirt sleeves making coffee because she had asked him to let her sit for a moment, which she had been asking with some frequency in recent weeks as her body adjusted to its new information. He set down the coffee pot. He turned around. He looked at her face and read it with the complete accuracy that had always been one of the things about him she most loved and found most maddening. "Alma," he said. "Yes," she said. "April, I think. Maybe late March." He crossed the kitchen and crouched in front of her chair and took her hands and looked at her. His eyes were doing several things at once, some of which she identified and some of which she thought might simply be private. "Are you well?" he said. "I'm tired and my stomach is uncooperative in the mornings," she said, "but otherwise yes. The doctor in Caldwell says everything looks fine." "You've already seen the doctor," he said. "I wanted to be certain before I said anything," she said. He looked at her for a long moment and then he put his forehead against her hands briefly, which was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen him do, and she put her free hand on the back of his head. Clara appeared in the kitchen doorway with unerring timing. She looked at them. She did the same calculation she had done in the garden in July of the previous year. "Is there going to be a baby?" she said. Isaiah looked up. Alma looked at her daughter. "Yes," Alma said. Clara came into the kitchen and stood next to them with her arms crossed and the expression that meant she was deciding something fundamental. "All right," she said. "But I have conditions." Isaiah laughed. The sound of it filled the kitchen the way sunlight fills a room when the window is open, and Alma felt it in her chest like something coming loose in the best possible way. "Tell me your conditions," Isaiah said, still laughing. "I'm to be consulted on the name," Clara said. "And whatever it is, it has to be able to work outside. I'm not going to have a sibling who won't go in the barn." "Those seem like reasonable conditions," Isaiah said. "And it has to be a boy," Clara said, because she had apparently given this considerable thought. "I have enough of my mother's hair. I do not need competition." Alma looked at her daughter with the particular love that is made entirely of exasperation and pride in equal measure. "We'll do our best," she said, "but I make no guarantees about that particular condition." The baby came in late March, 6 days early, in a snowstorm that was the first significant snow of the year, which Alma privately thought was appropriate given how her and Isaiah's story had begun. The doctor from Caldwell came and Mrs. Tanner came and Isaiah was home because his rotation had ended 3 days prior and he had stayed, though she had told him he didn't need to change his schedule, and he had said with complete finality that he was staying. He was a boy. 6 pounds and 14 ounces, with dark hair and a set to his chin that was unmistakably Isaiah's, and eyes that were presently the dark blue of newborns and would eventually settle into something else. Clara, who was 10 now and had been designated the official holder of the lamp during the proceedings, received the announcement with the satisfaction of someone whose conditions had been met. She inspected the baby with the same focused attention she applied to everything worth understanding. "He looks like you," she told Isaiah. "Possibly," Isaiah said. He was holding the baby with both hands in the careful way of a man who was not accustomed to holding something so small and was compensating by concentrating entirely. "He needs a name," Clara said. They had discussed the name, per their agreement. Alma had suggested and Clara had modified, and Isaiah had received the final proposal with the gravity it deserved. "Thomas," Isaiah said, looking at Alma, who nodded. "Thomas James Hudson." Thomas James Hudson objected to the naming with the vigor of a person who had opinions about a great many things from his very first day, which Clara said was a good sign, and which Alma thought was probably correct. The years settled into their shape around all of them, good years and difficult years and years that were both at once. Isaiah's work in the Indian Territory was meaningful and hard, and he carried the weight of it with the same steadiness he carried everything. And when he was home, the house was full of a warmth that Clara and Thomas James seemed to absorb into themselves, the way plants absorb sunlight, growing toward it automatically. Fitch served 3 of his 4 years before being released on account of his health, which was the kind of outcome that was imperfect and real, and which Isaiah discussed with her frankly when it happened, sitting at the kitchen table the evening he received the news. She had learned over the years of their marriage that he needed to say the difficult things directly, and she needed to hear them directly, and that this was one of the places where they fit together with particular precision. "He's out," Isaiah said. "His lawyer worked a medical petition. He'll be back in Caldwell probably." Alma held her coffee cup. Thomas James was 4 and asleep, and Clara was 14 and doing her lessons by the lamp. "Let him come back," Alma said. "The farm is ours. The court confirmed it. What he does or doesn't do now is his business." Isaiah looked at her for a moment. "You're not worried." "I'm not afraid of him," she said. "I was afraid of him in January 5 years ago when I had nothing but a deed and frozen hands. I have considerably more than that now." He looked at her with that expression she had been seeing for 5 years and still found entirely sufficient to make her feel like the version of herself she most respected. "Yes," he said, "you do." Fitch came back to Caldwell and was quiet. The scandal of the trial had reduced him considerably. His associates scattered, his capital depleted, his reputation in tatters. He opened a small dry goods shop on the edge of town and kept to himself, and Alma saw him exactly twice in the following 3 years, and both times he looked at her with an expression she did not find satisfying or troubling, only tired, and she nodded to him civilly as she would nod to any person she passed on the street, because she was not made of the stuff that holds grudges when the matter is settled. The matter was settled. Her land was hers. That was enough. Thomas James was 6 when Isaiah came home from his Muskogee rotation and said that he had put in his formal request for a reassignment, a position he had been offered in Caldwell as the supervising deputy for the Sumner County District, which would mean being home properly rather than in rotating periods. He said the work in the territory was being taken over by a younger officer he had trained and in whom he had complete confidence. He said Muskogee needed fresh eyes more than it needed his at this point. She looked at him across the kitchen table where he had said this with the same directness he said everything. "Are you certain?" she said. "Not for me, for you." "I'm certain for me," he said. "I've given the territory 11 years total between the two postings, and I've done what I could do there. The work here is real, and I know this county. And I want—" he stopped, started again. "I want to see Thomas James grow up from the same house instead of from 6 weeks away." She reached across the table and put her hand on his. "Then yes," she said. He took the Caldwell position and came home to stay, and the adjustment was not without its complications, because they had built a life around his absences, and rebuilding it around his permanent presence required some renegotiation of ordinary things. Who made the coffee, and who decided about the fence, and how to share a space that had been entirely hers for a long time. They worked through it with the same directness they had always worked through things, sometimes with patience and sometimes not, and always with the understanding that they were going somewhere together, and the direction was what mattered. The south field continued to be the most productive field on the property. James Webb, who was 26 now, had been given a formal partnership in the farming operation, taking a share of the profits in exchange for managing the daily work, which freed Alma to do the things she was actually best at, which turned out to be the books and the planning and the negotiation with buyers that she had discovered she had a considerable talent for. Thomas James, at 7, showed every sign of being exactly as systematic and determined as his mother, and exactly as patient and careful as his father, which Clara said at 17 was unfair, because she had had to develop those qualities over time, and he appeared to have arrived with them already installed. At 8, Thomas James decided he wanted to know about the law, which Isaiah taught him the same way he had taught Clara about the law, directly and without condescension, and which Alma found so exactly right she had to go do something in the other room for a moment when she first witnessed it. At 17, Clara went east to study, which she had been planning since she was 12, and which Alma and Isaiah supported completely, even though the leaving of her was a considerable thing. She went to a women's college in Ohio, which was practically speaking near the grandmother she had never properly known, and which was the kind of poetic turn that life sometimes made when you weren't watching for it. She wrote long letters home, systematic and detailed, full of what she was learning and thinking, and she came back in summers and the farm knew her the same way it had always known her, immediately and completely. It was the summer Clara came back for the 3rd time, the summer she was 20 and Thomas James was 11, that Alma stood at the south field fence in the late evening of a July day and felt, comprehensively and without qualification, the particular peace that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from the presence of everything that matters. Isaiah came and stood beside her at the fence. He had his coat off and his sleeves rolled, and he had been helping James Webb with the irrigation channel all afternoon, and he smelled of earth and warm air and himself. He stood close enough that his arm was against hers, and they both looked at the south field in the evening light, the corn high and the wheat rippling, the river at the bottom of the property catching the last of the sun. Thomas James found a garter snake in the vegetable garden, Isaiah said. He's named it Gerald. After Hoyt, she said. I asked the same question. He says no, he just liked the name. I believe him. She laughed. After 17 years, she still found that his capacity to be funny about small things caught her unprepared in the best possible way. She leaned her head against his shoulder. This was not how January was supposed to end, she said. No, he agreed. He put his arm around her. How was January supposed to end? I lose the farm, she said. I try to hold on long enough to make other arrangements. I write to my mother and receive another letter of sympathy. I spend the next several years being a cautionary tale about the difficulties of widows in the territory. He was quiet for a moment. That doesn't suit you, he said. No, she agreed. It doesn't. The evening was going purple at the edges, the way Kansas evenings did in July, vast and warm and going on forever in every direction. Thomas James shouted something from the direction of the house, probably about the snake. Somewhere a nighthawk was calling in the soft summer air. Isaiah, she said. Yes. I want another baby, she said. He turned to look at her. She looked back at him with the directness that was, she had been told by more than one person over the years, occasionally alarming in its completeness. You're 39, he said. I know how old I am, she said. I'm in good health and the doctor has not told me otherwise, and Thomas James is 11 and does not need to be the last. There's room in this house and this land and this life. I want it. He looked at her for a long time. She could see him working through it with the care he brought to important things, not dismissing it and not leaping at it but actually considering it. All right, he said. Yes. Yes, just like that. You've never asked me for anything impractical, he said. I trust your judgment. She shook her head. That is not the full answer. He smiled, and it was the same smile she had first seen outside the Caldwell Hotel in January 1878, the one that started at the eyes and took its time. I want it too, he said. If you're willing, I'm willing. She lifted her face and kissed him in the south field in the July evening, the same way she had kissed him in the garden in the July evening 8 years before, which was to say completely, and without the management of impression, and with full understanding of what she was doing and who she was doing it with. Thomas James, appearing from nowhere with the inexorable timing of children who are paying attention to everything, stood at the fence 20 feet away and looked at them, and then looked at the sky with the expression of a person who had decided he had not seen what he had seen, which was so exactly what Clara had done in the garden that Alma had to stop kissing her husband to laugh. The baby came the following May, 19 months before Clara finished her studies and came home for good and took up the management of the farm accounts with an efficiency that Alma found both restful and slightly unsettling, since she had been managing them herself for 12 years and had to make a deliberate effort not to look over Clara's shoulder every 5 minutes. The baby was a girl. 7 pounds even, with Isaiah's dark eyes and Alma's dark auburn hair, and the particular calm of a baby who has arrived into a house that is already full of people who have been waiting for her. Thomas James, who was 12, looked at her in the bassinet and said she was smaller than Gerald the snake, which was incorrect but reflected his scale of reference. Her name, Clara said, who was 22 and home for the birth and had been a formidable presence in the room throughout, should be decided by committee. Isaiah looked at Alma. Alma looked at Isaiah. They had, in fact, already decided. Eleanor, Alma said. Eleanor Ruth Hudson. Clara considered this for approximately 10 seconds and then said, That's acceptable. which from Clara was approximately the highest endorsement available. Alina Ruth Hudson was 3 months old when Isaiah's supervising Marshal from Wichita came to Caldwell for an official visit and sat at their kitchen table and drank their coffee and offered Isaiah a position in the Territorial Marshal's administration. Desk work mostly, oversight and training, based in Wichita, with a schedule that was fixed and predictable and came with considerably better pay and no field rotations. Isaiah thanked him and said he needed to discuss it with his family, and the Marshal said of course and left. Alma was nursing Alina in the parlor. Isaiah came and sat down across from her and said, "He offered me the Wichita position." "I heard," she said. She had not been eavesdropping, but the house was not large and the kitchen door was open. "I don't want it," he said. She looked at him. "Why not?" "Because Wichita is 90 miles from here and I've already done the version of this life where I'm not home," he said. "I don't want more of that. I want this." He gestured at the room, at Alina, at the whole warm, particular arrangement of their existence. "I want to be the Sumner County supervising deputy until I retire, and I want to be home every night for whatever is left of Thomas James's childhood and all of Alina's. And I want to have supper with you and argue with Clara about the farm accounts and teach Alina how to read and let Thomas James teach me whatever he decides to teach me, because he is extremely determined to teach me things." She looked at him for a long time. Alina made a small sound and settled. "You're sure?" she said. "I'm sure," he said. "All right," she said. "Write to the Marshal and decline it." He did. Thomas James became, in his own time, the kind of young man who learned everything about everything, and then picked the one thing he was best at and committed to it entirely, which turned out to be law. Not the federal marshal kind, but the practicing attorney kind, and he went east himself at 17, as Clara had done, and came back at 22 with a law degree and a quiet seriousness that was entirely his father's and a way of explaining things that was entirely his mother's. And he set up practice in Caldwell and was, within 5 years, one of the most respected attorneys in Sumner County. Clara ran the farm and ran it well and ran it with the systematism she had always applied to everything. And she married at 27, which she had taken her time about because she had taken her time about everything. A man named Howard Cass, who was an agricultural engineer from Nebraska, and who was sufficiently intelligent that Clara found him interesting and sufficiently patient that he could match her pace. And Alma liked him immediately because he listened the way Isaiah listened, which she had decided years ago was the fundamental quality. Alina grew up on the farm under the overlapping attentions of a father who taught her patience, a mother who taught her stubbornness presented as practicality, a brother who taught her the law by explaining cases to her at the dinner table from the time she was 4, and a sister who was 17 years older and who came home on weekends and made sure Alina could do the farm accounts by the time she was 12. Alina was not any of them. She was entirely herself, which was the best outcome available and the one Alma had hoped for without knowing quite how to hope for it. She was bold in the specific way that came from having always been taken seriously, quick with numbers, interested in everything, and possessed of a laugh that she had gotten from somewhere that none of the rest of them could identify, loud and sudden and entirely joyful. When Alina was 7, and Thomas James was 23, and Clara was 34, and Alma was 49, and Isaiah was 51. On a September afternoon when the south field was gold and the river was low and the farm was producing better than it ever had under Clara's management, they sat on the porch, Alma and Isaiah, without any particular occasion for sitting there except that the evening was beautiful and they were both done with the day's work. Alina was in the yard with a book. She was reading about birds, which was her current systematic interest. Every few minutes she looked up and pointed at something in the sky and reported it, which neither of them had asked her to do and which they both listened to with complete attention. "There's a red-tailed hawk," Alina said, pointing. "They're resident year-round. They hunt mostly from high perches." "Good to know," Isaiah said. "They mate for life," Alina said, with the directness of someone reporting a natural fact and not intending any subtext, though the subtext was there. Alma looked at Isaiah. He looked at her. His face was 51 years old and had the lines of 11 years in Fort Smith and Indian Territory and 21 years in Sumner County, and the particular depth of a man who had lived his life on purpose. She knew his face the way she knew the South Field, entirely and from all weathers, and she loved it the same way, beyond the point where love is a feeling you monitor and into the place where it is simply the condition of your existence. "Hawks have good sense," she said. Isaiah reached over and took her hand. The sun went down over the Kansas prairie in colors that cannot be adequately described, only witnessed, pink and gold, and the particular burning orange of late September that makes you understand why people came west in the first place. All that impossible open sky that promises something, and delivers it differently than expected, but delivers. Alina reported one more bird before the light went entirely, a nighthawk, same as the one Alma had heard in July 12 years ago when she had stood at the South Field fence and known that her life was what she had made it. The lamp was lit in the kitchen. Clara's voice drifted from somewhere inside the house, talking to Howard about the yields from the North Field. Thomas James's horse was in the barn because he had come for supper and stayed. Hester II, granddaughter of the original Hester, stood placidly in the paddock because Hester's descendants had inherited the original's equanimity along with her stubbornness. The deed for 252 acres of Kansas prairie land, river access included, was in the strongbox in the bedroom, and it would pass to Clara when the time came, and the farm would go on, and had gone on, and was going on now in the September evening with the lamplight warm in the windows and the family in it. Alma had stood in the snow outside a closed bank in January 1878 with a deed in her frozen hands and something approaching despair in her chest, and she had been found by a man with a badge and careful eyes who had said not today to whatever dark thing she had been considering, and she had said not today too, and here was the result. This porch, this evening, this hand in hers. She had been right to stand there. She had been right not to give up. She had been right about the deed and the farm and the judge and the fight, and she had been right, most importantly and most lastingly, about the tall man with the sheepskin coat who had walked up behind her in the snow and chosen, for reasons she had spent 20 years being grateful for, not to walk past. "Isaiah," she said. "Yes," he said. She turned and looked at his face in the last light. "Thank you," she said, which was not something she said to him often because they had long since moved past the territory where thank you was the right word for what was between them. But tonight it was precisely right, and she meant it in its fullest possible sense, for all of it, for everything from the snow to this moment. He looked at her. His eyes were the same eyes that had looked at her across a hotel dining table in a snowstorm, careful and warm and entirely present. "Thank you," he said back. Alina looked up from her book. "What are you thanking each other for?" she said. "Everything," Alma said. Alina considered this with the practical intelligence she brought to all questions. "That's a lot to thank someone for," she said. "Yes," Alma agreed. "It is." The September evening settled around them, warm and permanent and entirely their own, and the farm was quiet and full at once, and the South Field held its gold against the coming dark, and somewhere the red-tailed hawk that mates for life was settling into its high perch for the night, and on the porch in Sumner County, Kansas, in the year 1898, Alma Hudson held her husband's hand and did not let go.